In this video, Magnus Carlsen destroys his new rival Alireza Firouzja in the Game of the Year at the 2024 Global Chess League. Now, in the game, Alireza Firouzja is playing as white. He opens 1e4, best by test, and Magnus responds 1c5, the Sicilian Defense. Magnus is in a fighting mood this game. Now from here, Alireza knight to f3, intending d4 with the open Sicilian, and Magnus responds e6. He's heading for likely a Taimanov or a Kan Sicilian. Now here, Alireza Firouzja d4, heading for the open Sicilian. Now c takes, knight takes, and here Magnus has a big choice, and in the game, he goes a6, heading for the Kan variation of the Sicilian Defense. Now, this is a very combative opening choice by Magnus Carlsen. Here, Magnus is giving Alireza Firouzja the center. He can go c4, heading for a Maroczy bind, but Magnus clearly in a very fighting mood in this game. All right, now Alireza Firouzja c4, heading for the Maroczy bind, and now Magnus knight to f6, hitting the pawn on e4, knight to c3 defends the pawn, and then queen c7. And these are very standard developing moves in the Kan variation of the Sicilian Defense. Now from here, a3, blocking bishop b4 ideas. If Black did get that in, he would have a lot of pressure on that pawn on e4, as the knight on c3 would be pinned to the king. So a3, very solid move by Alireza. And now b6 for Magnus Carlsen, intending bishop b7, and perhaps later d6 with a sort of hedgehog pawn formation in the middle of the board and the queen side. Now from here, Alireza Firouzja, bishop b3 on the board, a standard developing idea, and Magnus goes bishop b7, putting more and more pressure on that pawn on e4. Currently the knight and the bishop do attack it, therefore Alireza does have to defend. In the game, he goes f3, a very solid move. However, it does weaken the dark squares around the king side a little bit, and Alireza is going to have to be very careful about that in the future. Now from here, Magnus bishop b7, intending short castles in the very near future, and Alireza goes bishop b2. Again, a very standard developing idea, intending short castles as well. Now here, Magnus d6 on the board, and we have that standard hedgehog pawn formation on the queen side and the center. And now, in case you're not familiar, this is called the hedgehog pawn formation with pawns on a6, b6, d6, and e6. And the idea is Black has a very solid but very passive setup, sort of like a hedgehog wound up with its spikes on the outside. Now from here, Alireza Firouzja castles, and Magnus Carlsen does the same, short castles on the board. And now here in this position, the opening phase of the game is mostly over. Both sides have castled, their kings are safe, and here Alireza Firouzja does have a slight advantage. His pawns on e4 and c4 do give him a little bit more space, and that means he is slightly better here. Now, what is Alireza Firouzja's plan? Well, it may include ideas like queen d2, rook fd1, rook ac1, finishing development, and then expanding on the queen side moves like b4, and then trying to find a key breakthrough on the queen side. So let's see how he does that here. In the game, rook to c1, just placing his rook opposite the black queen on the c7 square. Now Magnus Carlsen, knight d7, he continues developing. His idea is going to be finishing development, getting his rooks into the game, perhaps on c8 and then e8 or d8, and from there looking for breakthroughs in the center or on the queen side with moves like e5, d5, maybe b5, or maybe even the plan starting with h5 and then h4, gaining space on the king side. So we'll have to wait and see what Magnus Carlsen has in mind for this game. Now here, Alireza b4, expanding on the queen side. Magnus goes rook a to c8, a very standard developing idea in the Sicilian Defense. Now queen d2 gets the queen into the game, and rook f to e8. Now, real fast, e8 is often a very good square in these sorts of hedgehog positions, as Black may want to go d5 at some point, and if he does, the e file actually will be opened up after, say, e takes, or c takes, and then e takes. So the rook on e8 may not look active yet, but it can be very active in the future. So Magnus clearly knows what he's doing in this position. Now from here, knight b3 on the board for Alireza Firouzja. And the idea behind this move is the knight doesn't do a whole lot on the d4 square. And once you go knight to b3, that knight does support the idea of c5 in the future. And also that bishop on e3 does put pressure on that pawn on b6. So, for example, if Black were to go, say, queen b8, then a8, that bishop will be putting additional pressure on b6, which is a weak point in the Black position. So, knight b3, very solid move by Alireza. And now here in this position, Magnus does go queen to b8, a very interesting, undeveloping move. The idea being when the queen was on c7, it was sitting opposite that rook on the c1 square. That's a very uncomfortable place for the queen. So, queen to b8 on the board, getting the queen off that semi-open c-file, activate the rook on c8 a little bit better, and from here, Magnus may be intending queen to a8, putting additional pressure on this long diagonal with the bishop and the queen. So, very interesting multi-purpose idea by Magnus. Now here, Alireza, rook fd1, a very standard idea in this sort of position. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he plays a very interesting idea, expanding on the the king side, in the spirit of the Alpha Zero computer engine with the move h5. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, his plan is to go h4 and maybe even h3 at some point, gaining more and more space on the king side. Now this move is especially effective here, as that move f3 from Alireza Firouzja does weaken the king side a little bit. And real fast, if you're enjoying this video, please smash the like button. It's the best thing you can do to help me out. Now back to the video. From here, Alireza Firouzja, he's got most of his pieces on very good squares, but he's not really sure what to do. In the game, he goes bishop f4, trying to put additional pressure on that pawn on d6, but this turns out to be a very big mistake, and this move throws away most of his advantage in this position. Back here, he's got a very large advantage, but now after bishop to f4, Magnus finds the key idea here. He goes knight to e5, blunting the bishop on f4, and here Magnus is starting to take over in this game. Now, what's the idea behind this move knight to e5? Well, it's very simple. First of all, Alireza Firouzja cannot take the knight. If you take on e5, black just goes d takes e5, and believe it or not, those double pawns on the e-file are actually very, very strong. It's very difficult for Alireza Firouzja to attack the pawn on e5, and that pawn on e5 does control the dark squares on d4 and f4. So those pawns are actually a very good asset for Magnus here. So, all that being said, bishop takes e5 is not possible, and beyond that, the knight does block the attack on that pawn on d6. So very good multi-purpose move again by Magnus Carlsen. Now here, Alireza Firouzja, what should he be doing? Well, the computer quite likes queen to d4, trying to centralize the queen. Instead, Alireza does go knight to a4, increasing the pressure on that pawn on b6. Now, of course, the knight is attacking, black's going to have to do something, and in the game, Magnus goes bishop c6. By far the strongest move, defending the pawn with the queen, and also attacking the knight on a4 with the bishop on the c6 square. So very good move by Magnus. Now here, Alireza, instead of just retreating back to the c3 square, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, going knight to a4, then back to c3. Instead, here, he goes knight to b2, knight b2 on the board. A very solid move. And from b2, the knight does defend the c4 pawn. However, overall, Alireza Firouzja is playing quite a bit more passive than Magnus in this game so far, and here Magnus continues to increase the pressure. He finds the best move, a very strong idea, h4, expanding on the king side. He may be threatening h3 at some point, and that pawn is going to be just a nuisance in white's position. Now here, what should Alireza Firouzja be doing? Well, it's actually very difficult to find a good plan. In the game, he goes queen to e3, but this turns out to be a very weak move, and here Magnus, once again, he finds the problem with it immediately. He goes knight to g6, retreating the knight and putting pressure on that bishop on f4, and now because the queen is on e3 instead of d2, the bishop doesn't have access to the e3 square. Now, the only square you can move the bishop to maintain it is g5. That is what Alireza Firouzja does in the game. Bishop g5 on the board, but that is not a very good square for the bishop here, despite the fact that it does attack that pawn on h4. Now here, Magnus, his best idea, believe it or not, is going to be playing the move h3, pushing the h-pawn all the way down to the h3 square, and that would give Alireza a very uncomfortable choice. Do you take on h3, or do you go g3, weakening the king side further? Now instead here, Magnus goes b5, expanding on the queen side. His idea now is to attack and expand on both sides of the board. He's essentially playing for a win as black against one of the best players in the world right now in this position. All right, Alireza Firouzja, knight to d4 on the board, a decent regrouping of the knight, putting pressure on that bishop on c6. Now Magnus, bishop d7, just defending. And here, Alireza Firouzja, his best idea is going to be king to h1. He has to think about his king safety. Instead, he goes h3, trying to stop the idea of h3 from black permanently. However, the problem with this move is it does weaken the dark squares even more. Now, if black ever gets that d5 break in, the queen is going to be eyeing the g3 square, and queen to g3 will be possible. So Magnus here just taking over, and that is what happens. Here, Magnus, he just goes d5 immediately, trying to capitalize on those weakened dark squares in white's king position. Now here, the obvious threat from Magnus Carlsen is d takes c4, getting a protected pass pawn on the queen side. Obviously, Alireza cannot allow that, so what should he be doing? Well, he has a few different ideas. Let's go through them one by one. If he takes on d5 with the c-pawn, c takes d5, then Alireza just goes rook takes c1, followed by e takes d5, and suddenly the e-file is opening up, and that rook is perfectly placed opposite the white queen. That's going to be very, very difficult for Alireza to defend. Instead, e takes d5 is even worse. Obviously, e takes d5 back, and then again, the rook attacking the queen, that's going to be a disaster. Instead, back here, c takes b5 is also possible, but then once again, Magnus just takes on c1, then takes on b5 with the a pawn, and he's going to have an excellent game. Instead, Alireza goes for the fourth option here. That is just c5, expanding on the queen side, trying to keep the game closed. However, here, Magnus immediately spots one of the flaws of this idea, and he expands in the center with the move e5, gaining more space and driving the knight back. And now, real fast, I do want to say queen g3 right away was not only possible, it was maybe even a stronger idea, but instead, Magnus has a very specific idea in mind with his e5 move. It's very, very cool. All right, e5 on the board. Now here, Alireza, where should the knight go? Well, technically you can go to b3 or c2, but those are very passive moves. Instead, Alireza is a very aggressive attacking player. He jumps in with the knight to the f5 square. Now from here, Magnus, he knows you cannot allow that knight on f5 to live. He just takes on f5 with the bishop. Bishop takes f5. Now e takes f5. And then knight to f4 for Magnus Carlsen, jumping in with the knight. And now here, Magnus, he has those two very powerful pawns on d5 and e5. However, he does have some weaknesses in his position, including that pawn on the h4 square, which could be falling in the very near future. Now here, Alireza has a choice. He can take on f4, trying to knock off that very powerful knight off the f4 square. Instead, he allows it to live, and he takes the hanging pawn on h4 with the bishop. Now, this turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Instead, bishop takes f4 may have been the stronger idea. And now Magnus, he shows an incredible idea in this position. He jumps in with the knight, kamikaze style, knight g4 on the board. And no, this is not a knight sacrifice, as that bishop on h4 is also hanging. So if white takes the knight with either h takes g4 or f takes, then bang, bishop takes h4 wins back the piece immediately. But despite not being a piece sacrifice, it's a very cool idea. Now, of course, the knight is attacking the queen on e3. Therefore, Alireza basically has to take the knight right away. So, what do? Do you go h takes or f takes? Well, it turns out both moves are very playable. In the game, Alireza goes f takes g4, but again, h takes equally good for white here. And now bishop takes h4 for Magnus Carlsen, winning back the piece immediately. Now here in this position, Alireza Firouzja is up a single pawn. Of course, Magnus losing that pawn on the h-file. However, again, he does have those very strong pawns on d5 and e5, and now because Alireza went f takes g4, those are actually pass pawns in the middle of the board. So Magnus, his main idea now is just pushing those pawns down the board and creating more threats against the white king on the g1 square. Now here, Alireza Firouzja makes a very big mistake. He jumps in with the knight to the d3 square, knight d3 on the board. And this move does look very active, but it turns out it just doesn't work out here for very concrete reasons. Here, Magnus Carlsen expands in the center with the move d4, a very strong idea. Now, the queen is being attacked. It has to go somewhere. And Black's main idea is, once the queen moves, he's going to capture that bishop on e2 with the knight and then continue from there. So, no matter where the queen moves here, e4, f3, or d2, Magnus is just going to jump in with the knight. So, queen e4 on the board, but again, the other square is just as good. Now Magnus takes on e2, white takes back, and then e4 on the board for Magnus Carlsen. And this is his big idea. He just wants to push those pawns all the way down the board as far as he can. All right, Alireza Firouzja, his knight is being attacked. It has to go somewhere. Knight to f2 on the board, and then Magnus queen to f4, jumping in with the queen, escorting those pawns down the board. This is already getting very, very critical for Alireza. Now, rook f1 on the board, defending the f2 knight or over-defending it, and also setting up various discovered attacks with the knight. If the knight moves, the queen will be under attack. So Magnus has to respond. Queen e5 on the board, good square for the queen. And now rook c to e1, lining up the rook with the queen. But the one drawback of this move is the knight on f2 is now pinned by the bishop on h4. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, it is his turn to move. He goes queen to d5, sort of a waiting move. And here, Alireza Firouzja, he goes g5, expanding on the king side. What is the idea behind this move? Well, it's sort of a distraction. Here, Magnus Carlsen, his best idea is still going to be either d3 or e3, continuing to push those pawns down the board. Instead, if he does waste time trying to win a pawn on either f5 or g5, that will slow down his attack a little bit. Now here in the game, Magnus does fall for it. He goes queen takes f5. Magnus is a simple man. He sees a free pawn. He takes a free pawn. However, here, Alireza, queen to h5 on the board. That is part of the idea of g5, opening up this diagonal for the queen to get access to Black's king side. Now here, queen to h7, offering a queen trade. And fortunately for us, Alireza Firouzja does not go for the endgame. He goes queen to g4, keeping the queens on the board. Now, I do want to say the computer loves the idea of queen takes h7, but that's going to be an incredibly difficult endgame to defend with those pawns on e4 and d4. So instead, queen g4, keeping the queens on the board. Alireza knows from a practical standpoint, his only chance is to complicate the game, and to do that, he needs the queens on the board at all costs. Now here, Magnus, e3, continuing to expand. And here, Alireza Firouzja, he knows if he moves the knight, say to d3, he loses the rook on e1 to the bishop. You cannot allow that. So here, he counterattacks with the move g3, a very strong move. Now here, Magnus, what should he be doing? Obviously, you can take on f2, but then you're going to lose the bishop at some point as the bishop is now trapped. In the game, he actually goes e takes f2, but this is a big mistake, and it actually throws away most of his advantage in this position. Instead, he had to be thinking about bishop takes g3, this is the way, and then after queen takes, I do want to show this. After queen takes, the move for Magnus Carlsen is going to be e2, and the rook on the f1 square is trapped. So that would have been the way for Magnus to press his advantage in this position. Instead, here in this position, e takes f2 on the board for Magnus, taking the knight with check, not a bad idea, but now after king takes f2, Alireza Firouzja is actually close to equalizing. Now queen c2 on the board for Magnus, putting pressure on the king. Of course, that bishop on h4 is going to be lost sooner or later. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. Now here, the king's being attacked. King g1 on the board. And then bishop takes g5. Magnus saying, if I'm going to lose the bishop, I'm at least getting a pawn for it. Now queen takes, and here suddenly we have an equal material position where both sides have one pawn on the queen side or the center, those being the pawns on c5 and d4. But overall, this is a roughly level position, and both sides have their chances in this crazy queen and rook middle game sort of position. Now here, rook takes e1 on the board, rook takes, and d3. Magnus Carlsen knows he's got to push his pass pawn all the way down to d1 to win the game. All right, queen to f5 for Alireza Firouzja, pinning the pawn on d3 to the queen. Now, of course, if Magnus went d2, that would lose the queen outright, so you can't do that. Instead, rook to f8 on the board for Magnus. The idea behind this move is he is defending f7 preemptively. He knows Alireza Firouzja is going to go rook to f1 in the very near future, and that is what he does. Here in this position, rook f1, piling up pressure on f7. So very good idea having that rook on f8 in advance to defend. Now here, Magnus, queen to c3, sort of a waiting move, but also putting pressure on that weak pawn on the a3 square. Now Alireza, queen d5. The idea being he was to control that c6 square, and his plan at some point is going to be going c6 and then c7 and trying to get in c8, promoting to a queen. However, the problem with this move is it does hang the pawn on the a3 square. Here, Magnus takes on a3, queen takes a3 on the board, and here we reach yet another critical position in this game. Here, Alireza Firouzja, he decides to go for it on the queen side with the move c6. We're heading into a race with these c and d pawns flying down the board. However, this was a little bit of a mistake. Alireza Firouzja is worse here, and he did miss his chance to equalize the game on the spot with a ridiculous rook sacrifice, that being rook takes f7. The idea being, if the rook takes, you can basically give a perpetual check on the king with queen to d8, then queen h4 after king h7, and so on, and you just keep giving checks to the king, and the game will peter out to a draw. But instead here, c6 on the board for Alireza Firouzja. Again, we're going to have this race with the pawns racing down the board. Now from here, Magnus, he takes on b4. Magnus now having two extra defended pass pawns on the queen side. All right, Alireza c7. Technically, his pawn is more advanced, and now he is threatening queen to d8, at which point it's going to be very hard for Magnus to stop c8, promoting to a queen. Now Magnus, queen c4, attacking the queen and attacking the pawn on c7. Obviously, queen takes c4 is not possible, as after b takes, Magnus would be winning in the endgame with all those extra pawns on the queen side. So, queen d7 on the board for Alireza Firouzja, but then d2, and Magnus also threatening queen to c1 with the same ideas as Alireza Firouzja with queen d8. Now, rook d1 for Alireza, try to blockade that pawn and increase pressure on the pawn. But now Magnus, his best move, he still has the idea of queen to c1. For example, queen to c1, then if queen takes, you just take the pawn on the c7 square. So that would have been the strongest idea. Instead, Magnus here in time pressure. He goes queen c5, hitting the king, a little bit of a mistake. Now after king g2, Alireza Firouzja is back in the game. Now here, g6 for Magnus. Again, a little bit of an imprecise move. Again, queen to c1 was the right idea. Instead, g6 on the board, then rook takes d2, and king g7 for Magnus. Now here, Alireza Firouzja, once again, his plan is still the same. He's got to push through c7 somehow, some way. In the game, he goes queen to d8, blocking the rook's defense of that c8 square. Now Magnus, he goes queen to c6, giving the king a check. And where's the king going to go? In the game, Alireza Firouzja, king to h2, and then rook to e8 for Magnus Carlsen. The idea being the rook is defended by the queen, and now the rook has access to every square along the e-file here, which could be very important later in the game. Now here, Alireza Firouzja, h4, expanding on the king side. He actually wants to go h4, then h5, in the spirit of Magnus earlier in this game. However, this move is a mistake, but only if Magnus spots the right move, and that is the immediate rook to e1, threatening queen to h1 checkmate in one move. However, Magnus does not find this. He does not punish the move h4 with that. Instead, he goes b4, pushing on the queen side. But now, Alireza Firouzja, his risk paid off. He goes h5, expanding on the king side with all sorts of threats there. Now here, Magnus b3, continuing to expand, again missing the stronger idea of rook to e1. Instead, b3 on the board, and now rook to f2 for Alireza Firouzja, threatening queen to f6 in certain lines. Now here, g takes h5, wins the pawn on the h5 square, but that opens up the g file, and here Alireza spots that idea, queen g5 immediately on the board. Now Magnus, queen to g6, blocking the queen check. What is Alireza Firouzja going to do? Again, if you take the queen, then after f takes, Magnus has a winning endgame with those two extra pawns on the queen side. Instead, queen d8 on the board for Alireza Firouzja. Again, you can't take the queen, then c takes d8, promotes to a new queen, and you basically win a rook for nothing. So instead here, Magnus, queen to e6, guards that c8 square. Now c8 promoting to a queen is not possible. Then queen g5. Here, Alireza Firouzja is going to give the king a ton of checks. Queen to g5, then queen to c5, then queen to g5 back again, then queen to d8, again setting up various c8 ideas. Again, Magnus defends with the move queen to e6, again queen g5, king h8, and here rook to f6, finally breaking up that symmetry. Now, of course, Alireza Firouzja is threatening checkmate in one move, that being rook to h6 if Magnus moves the queen somewhere, say d7 or c8. So that is not possible. Here, Magnus gives the check to the king on the e2 square. Queen to e2, forcing the king back. In the game, king g1, then queen d1, rook to f1, blocks the queen check, then queen d4, once again hitting the king from the d4 square. Now, rook f2 blocks the check once again, but this allows the other idea, rook to e1, and now rook f1 blocking the check is not possible because of that pin by the queen on d4. Now here, king g2 on the board, queen to e4, rook to f3 blocking the check, rook to e2, once again attacking with the rook, and once again that rook on f3 is pinned to the king, so rook f2 blocking is not possible. Therefore, king to h3 by Alireza Firouzja, but then Magnus queen to e6, giving the king yet another check, and here Alireza Firouzja has a very difficult defensive task. How do you block this check by Magnus Carlsen? Well, it turns out there are a number of ideas. For example, queen to f5 is possible. Rook to f5, also possible here. Instead, in the game, Alireza Firouzja, he goes g4, blocking with the pawn. A very interesting idea, not necessarily bad, but just very interesting. Here, Magnus, he takes on g4 with the pawn, h6 g4, and here we have yet another critical position in this endgame. All right, what should Alireza Firouzja be doing? Well, the first thing you have to evaluate, is queen takes g4 a good move, or does that lose on the spot? I do want to show you this real fast if you made it this far. Here, queen takes g4, that is actually the strongest idea. Now, you may be wondering, what about the move rook to h2? Doesn't that win the queen on the spot? For example, rook h2, and then if king takes, queen takes. Well, yes, but white is still okay. Here's what happens. Rook to h2, the king takes, the queen takes, but then rook to h3, the king is going to have to move. You go rook g3 with a pin on the queen to the king on the g8 square, and you win back the queen, and everything's going to be all right in this crazy endgame. So, all that being said, way back in this position, queen takes g4 is perfectly playable. Instead, Alireza Firouzja, in time control, he couldn't calculate all of this out in advance. He went king g3, but this turns out to be a fatal mistake. Here, Magnus has the opportunity to seal the deal on the spot with rook to c2. Very complicated, but the idea being you guard that c8 square, stopping c8 promoting to a queen. But instead, g takes f3 on the board, he wins the rook, but then Alireza queen to h5 hits the king. Can Alireza get some sort of perpetual check going with the queen on the king or promote c7 to a queen? He would need to do one of those things to save this game. Alright, queen to h5, then king g7, then queen g5 hits the king, then king to f8, then queen d8 check, king g7, and here in this position, Alireza Firouzja has less than a second left on the clock, and he resigns on the spot before his clock runs out to Magnus Carlsen. But despite that, he still has drawing chances in this game with the move queen to g5, so Alireza resigning before he had to in this game. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and his new rival, Alireza Firouzja. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please smash that like button. It's the best thing you can do to help me out, so smash the like button and let me know in the comment section below what you thought of this video. And beyond that, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, and I'll see you in the next video.